The pen was already uncapped. Elena Vance set it on the table beside the document, a single, deliberate act that meant she had made peace with what came next. Around her, the 42nd floor conference room of Vance Capital Group hummed with the particular silence of people who have already decided not to speak. The skyline beyond the glass wall was gray. November had arrived without announcement. Stripping the last color from the trees below, she did not look at the document again. She had read it 3 times. The numbers did not change between readings. That was the problem with numbers. They were honest, in exactly the way that people rarely were. At 41, Elena had built Vance Capital from a regional lending house into a mid-tier financial services firm with assets under management that, at peak, had touched $4 billion. That was before the infrastructure fund, before the Meridian acquisition, before 2 consecutive quarters of losses that the board had quietly absorbed, then loudly refused to. She had known, walking into this room, what was going to happen. She had known for 3 weeks, which was when Preston Caldwell had taken her for lunch at a restaurant that cost more per plate than her first salary, and told her, with the gentle, unhurried delivery of a man who had broken careers before and found it not particularly unpleasant, that the board had lost confidence in the current path. She had ordered the sea base and eaten most of it. She had not cried or argued or made promises she couldn't keep. She had simply listened, because she was a person who listened before she responded. And by the time lunch was over, she had understood that the restructuring was not a suggestion. Now the assets were closer to $2.3 billion. The debt servicing was strangling every division, and the stock had shed 62% of its value in 14 months. Elena. The voice belonged to Preston Caldwell, chairman. He sat at the far end of the table, silver-haired and composed in the way that wealthy men become composed when the loss is someone else's. We've reviewed everything. The committee is in agreement. Filing Chapter 11 restructuring gives the firm the best pathway to protect stakeholder interests. Pathway. She noted the word. Preston had a talent for making inevitability sound like strategy. The filing window closes at 5, added Derek Marsh from her left. Marsh was the CFO 46, Yale MBA, a man who wore competence on his face like a second skin. He had been the one to prepare the final financial report, 40 pages of data, projections, and asset reconciliation. He had walked the board through it that morning for 90 minutes. Nobody had asked a hard question. The numbers were, as Derek liked to say, airtight. 3 attorneys sat along the wall, 2 consultants from the restructuring firm, a court-appointed liaison, 1 paralegal who had not stopped typing since she sat down. The room smelled like cold coffee and end-of-quarter desperation. Elena reached for the pen. She did not reach it. From the far corner of the room, not at the table, not even near it, a sound broke the quiet. A soft, involuntary one, the kind made by a small person trying not to make noise. Nobody turned. They had already learned to ignore the far corner. That was where the support staff waited, the ones managing document logistics for the filing. A young woman from legal records, a paralegal in a gray blazer, and Marcus Hale. Marcus had arrived at Vance Capital Group 11 weeks ago through a temp agency. His assignment was document processing, printing, collating, binding, flagging digital copies for archival. He worked quietly, arrived on time, and asked questions only when necessary. The office staff had no strong opinions about him. The senior staff had no opinions at all. He was 38, and he wore a dark green jacket that had been washed too many times. He was not tall. He was not imposing. He had the look of a man who had learned, through experience and not disposition, that drawing attention was rarely worth the cost. Beside him, half hidden behind the copier station that had been rolled in for document management, sat his daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 7 years old. She had brown hair in 2 uneven braids, a purple backpack on her lap, and a coloring book open across her knees. She was, by visible effort, being very still and very quiet. Marcus had not planned to bring her. The after-school arrangement had fallen apart at 2:15 when his neighbor had called with a family emergency. The filing couldn't be rescheduled. He had no other option. And so he had brought Lily in with the quiet understanding that she would sit behind the equipment station and not exist, professionally speaking, until the meeting ended. She had been excellent. She hadn't made a single sound for 40 minutes. The one she made now was simply because she shifted her weight and knocked her coloring pencil off her knee, and it rolled against the metal leg of the copier station with a soft ping. Nobody turned, except Elena. She glanced toward the sound, a reflexive thing, the instinct of a woman who had learned to notice small disruptions, and for 1 second, she saw the child. The braids. The coloring book. The 7-year-old trying to make herself invisible in the corner of a bankruptcy proceeding. She looked away. She picked up the pen. Marcus was not looking at the child. He was looking at the document on the screen, the large format display that Derek had left open, showing the final summary table of the financial report. Page 40, the consolidated overview, the one that had been on screen for the last 2 hours while the board reviewed. He had been looking at it for 6 minutes. His jaw was tight. His hand was still. The pen touched the first signature line. Marcus had not intended to speak. That was the truth of it, the fact he would return to later, alone in his apartment, when Lily was asleep and the building had settled into its late-night sounds. He had looked at the number, and then he had looked away, and then he had looked back. And something in the pattern of the data had refused to release him. He knew this feeling. He had spent 11 years learning to trust it, and 4 years trying to ignore it, and the 4 years of ignoring had been less successful than the 11 years of trusting. The screen showed a summary table with 14 cost categories. Each category had a reporting code, a project designation, a Q, 3 actuals figure, and a year-end projection. Most of the figures were consistent with the prior quarter report he had processed copies of 2 weeks ago. He had bound 27 copies of that document, and the act of binding required handling each page, and Marcus Hale had always been the kind of person who read what he touched. It was not something he had chosen. Exactly. It was the way his attention worked. It caught things. It had always caught things, since he was a boy doing his mother's taxes at age 14 because she had asked him once, and he had done it, and it had been correct, and she had never asked anyone else after that. Line 47 read, Project Helios Infrastructure Integration, costs $84. 7M. In the prior report, Project Helios had appeared under a different category code, and the figure had been $31. 2M. He did not move, he thought, with the careful habit of a man who had learned the cost of being wrong in public and the greater cost of being right in public without sufficient certainty about whether he was misremembering. He considered the possibility that the categorization had been legitimately revised between quarters. He thought about the bureaucratic ordinariness of reclassifications, the dozens of reasons an accountant might move a line item, the possibility that there was a memo somewhere that explained everything and that he was simply not aware of it because he was a contractor who processed documents, not a person who attended strategy meetings. He gave this possibility its full due. Then he looked at the category code again. Then he looked at the subtotal that line 47 fed into, and the ratio that subtotal informed, and the threshold that ratio had to clear. Then he understood. The pen was on the first signature line. Elena had not signed yet. She was pausing the hesitation of a woman who did not pause easily. The last pause of a person standing at the edge of something permanent and irreversible, giving it one final moment before stepping across. Marcus said, quietly and without inflection, "You missed this number." It did not stop the room immediately. It stopped Elena. She heard it, the voice low and even, coming from the wrong direction, from the part of the room where nobody with authority was standing, and her hand stilled on the document. Not because she trusted the voice, because she had learned, in 20 years of finance, that the sentences spoken by people without authority were often the ones worth hearing. The room caught up 2 seconds later. "Excuse me." Derek Marsh's voice had the texture of a door being closed. He turned toward the corner. "This is a closed proceeding." The paralegal at the wall kept typing without looking up. One of the attorneys, a man named Gerald Forsyth, from the restructuring firm, shifted in his chair with the visible discomfort of someone who had just heard a procedural violation in progress. The two security staff members near the entrance straightened. One of them took a step toward the copier station. Marcus did not move toward the table. He did not raise his voice. He stood where he was, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the copier station. And he repeated the same sentence with the same lack of inflection. "You missed this number." "Who is this person?" Preston Caldwell asked, not loudly, but in the specific register of a man who expected answers. "He's contract support," someone at the back said. "Document processing." "Then he doesn't." "Which number?" Elena said it. Her voice was flat. It was not an invitation. It was a precise, surgical question. The room registered the surprise, but nobody spoke. Lily had gone completely still behind the copier station. The coloring book was closed in her lap. She was watching her father with the focused, serious attention of a child who understood that something important was happening. Marcus looked at the screen. "Line 47, he said. "Project Helios." Derek Marsh laughed. It was a short, practiced sound, the laugh of a man who had used it before, in other rooms, to close conversations he didn't want to have. It was the kind of laugh that carried dismissal inside it, like a blade carried inside silk. "Line 47 reflects a category reclassification approved by the audit subcommittee and the category changed," Marcus said. "The project didn't." Marsh stopped. Everyone at the table was looking at Marcus now, not with respect, not yet with the specific attention of people who have been interrupted in a ritual and want to know how serious the interruption is before they decide how to respond to it. Marcus had their attention and did not appear to want it. He was looking at the screen. "The prior quarter report coded Helios under infrastructure maintenance," he said. "Integrated into the fixed asset depreciation schedule. At $31.2 million. This report codes it under operational integration costs. At $84.7 million. He said the numbers the way you say numbers when they are simply numbers without emphasis. Without drama. The way a physician reads a scan to a patient and allows the image to carry its own weight. The room was quiet now in a different way. Not the quiet of people waiting for something to end. The quiet of people recalibrating. There is a particular silence that falls in a room when logic enters it uninvited. It is not comfortable. The people in the room had been in agreement 20 minutes ago. They had been unanimous. The bankruptcy filing had been the conclusion of a long and properly documented process, reviewed by attorneys and certified by an auditor, and presented to the full board in a 40-page report that had been, as Derek Marsh liked to say, airtight. Airtight things, Marcus understood, failed in one of two ways. They were punctured, or they were never as airtight as advertised. A reclassification of that size, Marcus said, moves $53 million from a capital expense line to an operational loss. That changes the debt-to-equity ratio. That changes the solvency picture. That changes whether a Chapter 11 filing is the rational next step or a premature one. He said it without heat, without the defensive posture of a man trying to prove something about himself. He said it the way he had once said things in other rooms, rooms where the furniture was better and the suits were more expensive, and the stakes were, technically, measured in larger numbers with the clean, unhurried confidence of a person who had done the arithmetic 3 times over and was simply reporting what the arithmetic found. He was not performing authority. He simply had it, in the way that some people have it, not because of the room they're standing in, but because of what they know and the steadiness with which they hold it. One of the attorneys on the wall, not Forsyth, the other one, a woman named Claire Adelman, who had said nothing since she arrived, had turned slightly in her chair and was looking at Marcus with an expression that was carefully neutral but attentive in a way that courtroom lawyers get. Something evidentiary has just entered the room. Derek Marsh's jaw moved slightly. The reclassification was, "Show me the approval documentation," Elena said. Silence. "Derek." Her voice had changed. Not louder. Denser. The way a material gets denser when you compress it. "Show me the subcommittee approval for a $53 million category reclassification. The signed documentation." Marsh reached for his tablet. He scrolled. He scrolled with the careful deliberation of a man who was not finding what he needed but needed to look as though he was still looking. He scrolled for too long. Preston Caldwell watched him from the far end of the table, and something shifted behind the chairman's eyes, not alarm, not yet, but the beginning of a question forming, the kind of question you do not want to find yourself asking at the end of a process you had believed was thorough. Marcus had not moved from his position beside the copier station. He hadn't stepped forward. He hadn't tried to insert himself into the table. He had simply spoken, and the room had rearranged itself around what he said, the way spaces sometimes rearrange around something true. Lily reached out and touched the back of her father's hand with 2 fingers. A small, private gesture. The kind that passes between 2 people who have learned each other's language. He didn't look at her, but his hand turned slightly, and she pressed her fingers against his palm for a moment, and then released them. She had learned this from him. The way to say I'm here without requiring anything back. You're right, Dad, she said, barely above a whisper. The voice of a 7-year-old who had heard her father talk about numbers at the kitchen table, and at the dinner table, and occasionally in the car, and had come to understand that when he said something about numbers, it was because he had looked at them long enough and carefully enough to be certain. Nobody else heard it. Marcus heard everything. Derek Marsh found a document. He turned the tablet toward the room and said the reclassification had been discussed in the subcommittee meeting of September 14th. Discussed, Elena said. Approved verbally, and, show me the signed documentation. There was no signed documentation. What followed was not a collapse. Collapses are loud. What happened was quieter. A series of careful men in expensive suits, discovering that the story they had been told about the numbers was not the story the numbers told about themselves. Marcus spoke once more. He had not planned to speak again. He had given them the thread, and the rest was their pull to make, but Elena was looking at him, and her look was not dismissive. It was the look of someone who understood that the thread ran further. There's a second number, he said. He moved to the display screen. He asked first, a brief gesture toward the controller, and Elena nodded and brought up the spreadsheet backing data that had been filed with the report as an appendix. Line 47 feeds into the Q4 loss projection here. He highlighted the cell, which drives the solvency ratio below the covenant threshold. He moved to the next cell, but Project Helios has a contingent revenue agreement. It's in the deal memo. I processed those documents 6 weeks ago. If the project delivers Phase 1 completion by December 31st, there's a $28 million milestone payment from the municipal contract. He highlighted a third cell. That payment isn't on this report. The room was absolutely still. If the $53 million cost reclassification is reversed, and the contingent $28 million payment is included in the Q4 projection, the solvency ratio doesn't breach the covenant threshold. He set the controller down. Not even close. He stepped back. The company isn't insolvent, he said. It's been made to look insolvent. The room broke in 2 directions at once. Preston Caldwell leaned back in his chair and said nothing. He was watching Derek Marsh. Derek Marsh stood up. The tablet went face down on the table. A small, involuntary act of concealment. This is a contractor who has been in this firm for 11 weeks. He has no clearance, no context. No, he's correct about the contingent payment clause, said a voice from the wall. Everyone turned. The speaker was a woman named Sandra Okafor. From the external audit team, she had been brought in by the restructuring firm 3 weeks ago and had said perhaps 40 words in total since then. She was looking at her own laptop. I flagged the contingent revenue clause in my preliminary review. It was excluded from the final report on the grounds that completion by December 31st was considered unlikely. She paused. That assessment came from a memo authored by the CFO's office. Derek Marsh said, the project is behind schedule. By 11 days, Sandra said. As of last Friday. The project manager submitted a revised timeline indicating on-time delivery is achievable. She turned the laptop to face the table. I have the report here. The room now had a new geometry. The wall of consensus that had surrounded the bankruptcy, filing the unanimous agreement, the procedural certainty, the polished inevitability of Derek Marsh's 40-page report had developed a structural crack. and cracks Elena Vance had learned long before she was a CEO. Do not stop growing once they start. She looked at Derek Marsh. He was still standing. His face had the particular quality of a man choosing between two bad options and finding neither acceptable. Sit down, Derek, Elena said. He sat. She looked at Marcus, who had returned to his position beside the copier station. He had not claimed any of the space in the room. He stood the way he had stood for the last 2 hours, slightly back, weight distributed evenly, hands loose at his sides. She had a question forming that she was not yet ready to ask. Sandra, she said instead. I want a rapid reconciliation. Both numbers. Right now. I'll need 20 minutes, Sandra said. You have 15. Sandra worked at the far end of the table with 2 members of her team who had been called in from the anteroom. The attorneys consulted in low voices. Preston Caldwell did not move from his chair but had the alert, watchful stillness of a man revising a long-held assessment. Derek Marsh sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing. Lily, behind the copier station, had quietly reopened her coloring book but was not coloring. She was watching the woman with the laptop who was working fast, and her expression had the absorbed fascination of a child who has wandered into something she doesn't fully understand, but can sense, with the animal precision of children, is important. Marcus stood and waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned patience in the particular school of single parenthood. The kind where you cannot afford to collapse, where the small person across the breakfast table is watching you every morning for information about whether the world is survivable. He had learned it even more deeply in the year after Claire died, when every day had been a kind of endurance test, and the only way through it was the same way through everything. One number at a time, one step at a time, one morning at a time. He did not look proud. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had said what he needed to say and was now simply present. The way witnesses are present, not as participants, but as people who have been necessary and know their role has not expanded beyond that. At minute 13, Sandra looked up. The reclassification is unsupported, she said. There is no audit trail for moving Project Helios from capital to operational. The change appears in the final report, but not in the working files I reviewed 3 weeks ago. She paused. The version of the working file I have does not match the version submitted to the board. The room had gone absolutely still, the particular stillness that comes not from calm, but from the suspension of breath. The contingent payment, Sandra continued, her voice steady and professionally uninflected, was excluded based on a probability assessment memo dated October 28th. The project manager's updated timeline was submitted November 1st, 3 days later. The October 28th memo was not revised or superseded in the official file. She set down her pen with a small, deliberate sound. The report presented to this board today does not reflect the most current data available to the CFO's office. She left the precise weight of that sentence in the air. Preston Caldwell said, Sandra, are you telling me the financial report was manipulated? Sandra looked at him steadily. I'm telling you the data doesn't support the report as written. The determination of intent is not within my scope. It was within someone else's scope. Everyone in the room understood which scope it was and who would eventually carry it. Across the table, Derek Marsh had gone very still. The specific kind of stillness that is not calm, not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who has stopped moving because every direction available to him has become, in the last 4 minutes, wrong. Claire Adelman, the attorney on the wall, had opened a fresh document on her laptop and was typing. Elena looked at Derek Marsh. She looked at him for a long moment. In the years she had run this company, she had sat across from him in quarterly reviews, in hiring decisions, in crisis meetings, in the tedious hours of governance documentation that nobody outside the room ever saw. She had trusted his numbers. She had built the reporting structure of this firm around the assumption that the numbers he gave her were the numbers that existed. That assumption had cost her 11 months. It had almost cost her the company. She did not say any of this. There was nothing to say that the evidence had not already said more precisely. Sit down, Derek, she said. He was already seated. She said it anyway, because what she meant was, "This is over." Then she looked at Marcus. He had not moved. He was standing in the same position he had held for the last hour, slightly back from the action, weight distributed, no claim on the space or the outcome. She had a question forming that she was not yet ready to ask. "Sandra," she said instead, "what do the corrected figures show?" Sandra looked at her laptop. With the reclassification reversed and the contingent payment included in the Q4 projection using the project manager's confirmed delivery timeline, the debt-to-equity ratio sits at 1.84. The covenant threshold is 2.1. She met Elena's eyes. "You're not in breach. You are not going to be in breach." Elena picked up the unsigned bankruptcy filing. She held it for one moment. Then she set it face down on the table to her left. "The filing is suspended," she said. "Effective now." The room took 40 minutes to decompress. The attorneys pivoted with practiced efficiency, from filing logistics to evidence preservation. Sandra's team began the documentation chain for a formal internal audit. Gerald Forsyth from the restructuring firm made a phone call that he conducted in the corridor with the door open, voice low, and returned with the expression of a man recalibrating his billable hours. Preston Caldwell crossed the room and stood beside Elena. He did not apologize, men like Preston rarely did, and Elena did not expect him to, but he said, "We should convene tomorrow with independent counsel present." She nodded. They had reached the same conclusion by different routes, which was how consensus sometimes worked when the foundation had been correctly rebuilt. Derek Marsh was escorted to a side conference room by two of the firm's attorneys. Not arrested, that was not how these things worked. Not yet. Financial investigations moved through documentary layers before they became anything more visible. But he was separated from the data and from the room in which he had been, until approximately 90 minutes ago, the most authoritative person on financial matters. He walked out of the room without looking at Elena, and without looking at Marcus. He looked at the floor. Marcus watched him leave without expression. Through all of this, Marcus waited near the copier station with the patience that had become his natural register. He helped Lily zip her backpack. He answered one procedural question from Sandra's team about the documents he had processed 6 weeks ago. The deal memos for Project Helios, the ones that contained the contingent revenue clause. He provided the reference number and filing date without consulting anything. He had a memory for this kind of thing, the specific memory of someone trained to notice what others had stopped looking at. The room emptied gradually. The court-appointed liaison departed first, with an expression suggesting his Tuesday had not gone as expected. The paralegal packed up. The restructuring consultants conferred briefly and left together. Preston Caldwell made his way out last, pausing near the door to look back at Elena with something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it, the adjusted regard of a man who had underestimated the room. And then the room was smaller. Elena at the window, Marcus near the equipment station, Lily standing beside her father with the purple backpack on both shoulders. The November light was the same color it had been 2 hours ago, flat, gray, honest. But the room felt different, in the way that rooms feel different after the people with certainty have left. Elena looked at Marcus. There were things she wanted to say and she was filtering them, which was a habit she had built in boardrooms and depositions and difficult conversations over 2 decades. Let the unnecessary things fall away first, then say what remains. What remained was a question. "What did you do before this?" she asked. He told her. The firm, the division, the years. She knew the name, everyone in their industry knew it, and she held the knowledge of it against the image of him standing beside a copier in an 11-week temp assignment, and the gap between those two things was large enough to be its own kind of story. "Why did you leave?" He glanced at Lily, not for rescue, not for permission, simply in the way that a parent sometimes glances at their child when a question brings the child into the room, even if the child is already physically present. "I needed time," he said. "After my wife died. The kind of job that would have used what I know doesn't have the kind of hours that let you be somewhere at 3 o'clock every day, or go to school plays, or stay home when someone has a fever." He said it without any of the textures that the statement might have carried, without self-pity, without performance, without asking her to feel anything about it in particular. He said it the way he said everything, as information. The temp work was the right answer for the right period. Flexible, honest. I knew what it was. Elena looked at him. She was not a sentimental person. She had spent 20 years in an industry that rewarded the absence of sentiment. And she had adapted to that reward structure with sufficient discipline that some people who knew her professionally used the word cold, which was inaccurate. She had warmth. She simply chose its recipients carefully. But she was looking at this man in a dark green jacket that had been washed too many times, in a room where he had just saved her company without raising his voice, and she was feeling something that she could not immediately classify. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was present. It was something closer to the sensation of being corrected by something real, the particular humbling of someone who had believed their system was complete and found, in a single afternoon, that it had a gap large enough to walk a company through. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had not expected her to say it today, in this room. But he did not look surprised, in the way of someone blindsided. He looked like a man who was checking himself before responding. "What kind of position?" he said. "Advisory, fraud detection and financial oversight. Contract terms, not staff. I understand the flexibility requirement." She had thought about this carefully, more carefully than the speed of the question suggested. "Your hours set the schedule. The engagement level is yours to define. I need someone who can look at what everyone else has already decided is final and tell me what they missed." Marcus looked at the table, then at Lily, who was watching him with an expression of patient, comprehensive attention. "I have to get her home first," he said. "She has a math test tomorrow." Elena said, "Of course." He left. Elena stood in the emptied room for several minutes after he was gone. The unsigned document still face down on the table beside her. The skyline still gray outside the glass. She picked up the document eventually and handed it to one of the remaining attorneys for safekeeping. Then she called her assistant and said to clear the following morning entirely. There was a great deal of work ahead. Elena did not go home at 6. She did not go home at 8, or 10, or midnight. She stayed at the office with Sandra's team and 2 outside attorneys and worked through the audit materials until the picture was clear enough to be actionable. By 2 in the morning, they had documented 9 specific discrepancies in the financial report. By 4, they had traced the chain of authorization for the Helios reclassification to 3 documents, 2 of which bore Derek Marsh's digital signature and 1 of which bore a timestamp from a date when Derek Marsh had been, according to his own calendar, traveling in Frankfurt. She slept 4 hours on the couch in her office, her jacket folded over the armrest, the city outside cycling through its overnight quiet into early morning gray. She had built this company over 12 years. She had made significant errors along the way. The Meridian acquisition had been the largest, an overreach driven by ambition and insufficient due diligence. But she had built it on a belief that the oversight systems she had installed were sufficient. That good structure protected against individual bad faith. Derek Marsh had been inside her structure for 9 years. He had passed every review. The audit committees had found nothing. The external firm had found nothing. A man processing documents in a corner had found it in 6 minutes. She sat with this for a long time on the office couch, not sleeping, looking at the ceiling of a room she had chosen the paint color for in 2019. What she had missed was not the number. What she had missed was simpler and more structural. She had stopped asking the question. The systems were good, so she had trusted the systems. And that trust had become a kind of sleep, comfortable, reasonable, and precisely what someone needed her to maintain in order to do what Derek Marsh had done. At 6:40 in the morning, she called the board chair. At 7, she called her attorney. At 10, she made a third call. She delayed it because she was not certain of its protocol, whether it was appropriate, whether it crossed a line she had not yet mapped. In the end, she made it because the alternative was not making it, and she had spent enough of the last 14 months making the conservative choice. A temp agency dispatcher, named Helen, gave her a home address after a brief conversation about the nature of the request. The board meeting had been brief and, for once, unanimous in a direction Elena had not expected to be unanimous again. That was handled. This was different. Marcus lived on the third floor of a building in Garfield Park. The elevator was out. She climbed the stairs carrying a coffee she had bought at the corner place because she had needed something to do with her hands on the walkover. She knocked. He opened the door in a dark gray sweater and reading glasses, which he removed when he saw her. Behind him, the apartment was small and scrupulously clean, a kitchen that smelled like toast and coffee, and the particular warm dryness of a home where the heat is reliable. A table with a math worksheet on it, presumably the one from the night before, now corrected, and a small pair of red sneakers beside the chair. Bookshelves along every wall, not the decorative kind with matching spines and objects between them, but the working kind, full, organized, annotated in some places with sticky tabs that had been there long enough to curl at the edges. She saw 3 forensic accounting texts, a collection of case law around securities fraud, 2 novels with broken spines, a children's chapter book with a bookmark near the end. "Miss Vance," he said. "Elena," she said. "Can I come in?" He considered her for a moment, not with suspicion, with the deliberate attention of a man who did not make quick decisions about anything. Then he stepped back from the door. She sat at the kitchen table when he gestured to it. He sat across from her. He did not offer her coffee because she was already holding some, and he was the kind of person who observed what was already present before offering what wasn't. "I want to apologize," she said. He waited. "Not only for the room," she said. "For 11 weeks. You walked through that building every day and nobody saw you. That is a structural failure of the environment I created. And it is mine," he said, carefully. "You had other things to look at. That's not an excuse. It's a contributing factor, which is a different thing." He acknowledged the distinction with a slight nod. She was learning, a person who noticed fine gradations and did not pretend they were the same. She walked him through the audit findings. He asked 3 questions. Precise, economical. She answered them. He asked no others. "The Chapter 11 filing is formally rescinded," she said. "We're pursuing debt restructuring under existing covenant terms, which are not in breach. The board authorized the forensic review this morning. Derek Marsh has retained counsel." A pause. "Project Helios delivers December 19th. The $28 million milestone payment clears December 23rd. "Good," he said. It was a simple word, but he meant it the way simple words get meant when they are the accurate ones. She sat with this for a moment, the smallness of the word against the size of what it was responding to. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He looked at her. "Advisory. Fraud detection, financial oversight, internal control review. Contract terms, not staff." She had spent part of the previous night working through the terms. "Flexible engagement structure. Your hours define the schedule. I need someone whose job is to look at what everyone else has decided is settled and determine whether it actually is." Marcus looked at the worksheet again, then at the bookshelves, then back at her. "Lily is in 2nd grade, he said. "She has school plays and field trips and dentist appointments, and days when she's sick and needs someone to sit on the couch with her." He was not apologizing for any of this. He was not asking her to feel anything about it. He was stating the parameters of his life with the same flat accuracy with which he stated everything as data that needed to be factored correctly. She is the fixed point. Everything else configures around her. "I understand," Elena said. "I need you to understand it in practice," he said. "Not unkind. Not aggressive. Precise. Not the version of understanding that holds until there's a crisis that makes it inconvenient." Elena held his gaze. She had been in enough rooms with enough people over enough years to know the difference between someone setting a condition and someone testing her. This was neither. This was a man describing the architecture of his life and asking her to be honest about whether she could build around it. "Then I'll put it in writing," she said. "Whatever terms you need. In the contract. With signatures." He said he would think about it. She said that was fair. She left her coffee cup on the table. He didn't offer to walk her out. She descended the 3 flights of stairs and stepped back into the November morning, where the air was cold and clear and the neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do, running its own small operations, independent of the large ones, indifferent to the 42nd floor. She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment, without starting it. Then she drove back to the office, where there was a great deal of work still to be done, and she was, for the first time in 11 months, not afraid of it. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled like pine resin from the lobby Christmas tree, Marcus Hale submitted his first advisory report to the CEO's office of Vance Capital Group. It was 11 pages. It identified 4 risk exposure areas in the current restructuring plan that the external advisors had not flagged. It proposed a monitoring framework for related party transactions. It suggested an anomaly detection protocol for category reclassifications above a certain threshold. A simple rule, almost obvious in retrospect, that would have caught what Derek Marsh had done before it reached a final report. It was, in the dry language of internal audit documentation, thorough, well-sourced, and actionable. Elena read it twice in her office, alone, with the door closed and the skyline doing its gray November work outside the glass. She sent back 2 questions. He answered them by email in the same register as everything else. He communicated economical, accurate, without the performative deference that some people use to signal they understood the power differential, and without its opposite either. He treated her the way he treated the numbers, directly, without ornamentation. The formal engagement began December 1st. His hours were 9 to 2, Monday through Thursday, with no meeting scheduled after 1:30. The arrangement was written into the contract with the specificity he had requested, each term spelled out in the plain language that lawyers sometimes resisted and that Elena had insisted on. On the days Lily had early dismissal, he worked from home. Nobody questioned this. Elena had made clear, once, in a brief and sufficient conversation with the operations team, that it was not to be questioned. Derek Marsh was formally terminated in the first week of November. The board referred the matter to the SEC. By mid-December, the SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry. The process would be long and procedurally tedious in the way that justice in financial matters always was slow, documentary, argued over by attorneys in rooms with better furniture than the one where it had started. But it had started. Project Helios delivered Phase 1 on December 19th, 2 days ahead of the revised schedule. The milestone payment of $28 million cleared on December 23rd. The debt covenant was not in breach. The restructuring plan moved forward on terms that were difficult but survivable. The stock did not recover immediately. These things never did. But by the second week of January, 3 institutional investors had increased their positions, citing what one analyst's note described as improved governance transparency and evidence of internal control strengthening. It was the language of careful optimism, which was perhaps the most accurate language for the situation. On the afternoon of December 20th, which was a Friday, Lily's class had a holiday party. Marcus picked her up at 2:15, which was when he had always picked her up. She had made something in art class. She showed it to him on the walk home, a drawing on construction paper, the kind of thing that 7-year-olds make, with the full seriousness of total artistic commitment. It showed 2 figures. One was tallish, with a green jacket, rendered in crayon, with the jacket slightly too big and the hair slightly too dark, which was accurate. The other was smaller, with brown braids and a purple backpack. Between the 2 figures was a large number. She had drawn it carefully, in red, taking up most of the center of the page. Beneath it, in the careful capital letters of a child still learning to write, Dad fixed a number and fixed everything. Marcus looked at it for a long time. I didn't fix everything, he said. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. You fixed the important part, she said. The part that the other parts needed. He folded the drawing and put it in his jacket pocket. The inner one, against his chest. Elena saw the drawing 3 months later. It was on the wall of Marcus's home office, the second bedroom of the Garfield Park apartment, which he had arranged into a workspace sometime in January. He had mentioned it once, offhandedly, when she had called to discuss the Q1 risk framework, and she had asked, and he had described it without embarrassment as Lily's assessment of the Vance Capital situation. She asked if she could see it sometime. He said it wasn't going anywhere. She visited the office twice in the next quarter for working sessions. It was efficient, he had pointed out. And she had agreed without debate. On the second visit, Lily was there for the first hour before her school day began, eating cereal at the kitchen table and doing reading homework with the focused industriousness of a child who had been raised in an organized household, a child who understood that mornings were for work and that work was something worth doing carefully. At some point, she looked up at Elena, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee and a printout of the Q1 audit framework, and said, with the candor of the very young, "Do you like numbers?" "I'm learning to like them more," Elena said. Lily appeared to find this acceptable. She returned to her reading. Elena looked at the drawing on the wall of the home office. The green jacket, the purple backpack, the large red number in the center, the letters in careful capitals. She did not say anything for a while. She looked at the drawing the way she sometimes looked at the skyline from the 42nd floor, not searching for something, not preparing a response, just seeing what was there. The number in the drawing was 47. It was not the number that had saved the company. It was the number that Marcus had looked at long enough, in a room full of people who had stopped looking. That was the thing, Elena thought. Not the calculation. Anyone with the right background and enough time could have run the calculation. It was the looking, the willingness, in a room where the outcome had already been decided, and the consensus had already been reached, and the pen had already been uncapped, to keep looking at a number that everyone else had accepted as settled. She had trusted the completeness of her system so thoroughly that she had stopped performing the most fundamental act of analysis, asking whether she had missed something, whether the picture in front of her was the whole picture or only the part someone had chosen to show her. The most dangerous assumption in any room, she now understood, was not that the numbers were wrong. It was that they must be right, because no one had said otherwise. Silence was not validation. Unanimity was not truth. These were things she had known, abstractly, for 20 years of finance, and had forgotten in the particular, exhausting way that people forget the things they know most deeply when the pressure becomes intense enough, and the people around them are certain enough, and there is a pen uncapped and a document waiting. She had been in finance for 20 years, and she had learned it again, at the highest possible tuition rate, that the most dangerous moment in any analysis was the one where you stopped asking whether you had missed something. You never stopped. That was the work. Outside, Lily's school bus made its turn onto the street below, and the small sound of it, the engine, the squeal of brakes, the ordinary Tuesday morning noise of a neighborhood going about its life, came through the cracked window of a small, clean apartment on the third floor of a building where the elevator was still out, and the bookshelves were full, and the math worksheets were on the table, and someone had pinned a child's drawing to the wall of a home office, as though it were the most important document in the room, which, in the end, it was.